While Halo Esports is currently in an off-season for the holidays, the big topic of discussion over the last couple months and really throughout the year is about competitive settings and whether or not they're going to improve. It seems like recently things have been going backwards. If you frequent the ranked playlist, you know that along with 3 new maps, Argyle, Detachment, and Empyrean, come the biggest sandbox I think I've ever seen in a Halo game. Like, we're talking multiple fusion coils you can throw, rocket launchers with 4 rockets in the chamber, multiple shotguns, weapons all over the map just spawning continuously. And on top of the fact that there's been multiple buffs for different weapons like the Commando, the Pulse Carbine, the Plasma Pistol, things are just getting kind of crazy. It's a fiesta out here on these new maps, and pros are getting impatient, they're getting upset. So today, I just wanted to kind of share my 2 cents on what's happening here and talk a bit about conversations that are already taking place on Twitter between pros and developers, because thankfully it looks like the devs are actually starting to reply. We've got some back and forth here and maybe some positive changes coming in the near future. Now, this tweet from Bound I thought was particularly interesting. It's kind of a GA list, and I'm not sure how much time and effort was put into jotting all of this down, but I just wanted to talk a bit about the weapons that he's selected under checkmark and under X, and why it is that pros tend to believe that these weapons are bad for competitive play and want to either remove them or make some changes to their availability. Now, of course, I have talked about this topic before, and I understand it's a touchy subject between the casual and competitive community. Halo's identity is associated with a diverse sandbox. From a casual viewer perspective, seeing pros play with a variety of weapons sounds exciting. And from what I imagine is 343's perspective, Halo Esports is a big marketing opportunity for the game, viewed by thousands of people. They probably want to show the most appealing looking version of that game, but in some cases they do so at the sacrifice of the pro players, because from a pro perspective, skill and balance is extremely important. If these weapons are heavily impacting skill and balance, then you start hurting the health of your esports. So there's a tricky balancing act here. Okay, with that said, let's take a look at the good list. Now, he starts with rockets. Rockets, in my opinion, are a perfect power weapon in Halo, and that's because it is very obviously a power weapon. It's a freaking rocket launcher, right? You're probably going to get a free kill. There is a risk component. If you're not careful, you can kill yourself as well, but because it's so powerful, its advantage is always offset by its availability. It almost always spawns in the center of the map and spawns once every 3 minutes, so you gotta fight over it to earn it, and once you do earn it, you get an advantage of 2 rockets. Now, note that having 2 rockets in the chamber and not 4 is something that has been tested in Halo Esports for years at this point. All throughout Halo 5, it was a controversial topic, and because Halo Infinite's a tendency to snowball kind of mirrors Halo 5, I do think it should stay at 2 rockets. Having 4 rockets and the ease of getting a kill can just completely flip a game and snowball a game. It's a lot. It's a lot of power for a pro to have. So I like it where it is, and I hope that they change it back on the remake of the Pit. For some reason, there's 4. He's got Snipe next. Not too much that needs to be said. I mean, one of the most skillful, if not the most skillful weapon in the game currently. It's not going anywhere. Frags and Stickies, no real major concern here. They've been a part of the franchise since the beginning. They have their own clear advantages and drawbacks and, skill associated with using them. Even the Frags recently got a little nerf of an extra 0.2 seconds to detonate. The one thing I'm curious about from you guys in the comments and pros is what you think of the amount of frags that you spawn with and whether or not that's an issue. Currently, we spawn with 2. If that shifted down to 1, would that be better for the game? Would that reduce maybe nade spam? Is nade spam an issue currently? Like, I'm thinking on live fire, for example, off the opening strat, there's nades that spawn on both sides of the map. So the tendency for some opening starts is to literally just spam 4 nades straight through top mid. And, maybe that's kind of silly, I think. So should changes be made there? Apart from that, I think, maybe I've heard of, inconsistencies with like magnetism with frags or stickies and whatnot. But overall, I'd say they're in a decent spot, just about whether or not you'd reduce the amount off spawn. Untimed power-ups and power weapons. I like that Bound said untimed. We haven't seen this in competitive Halo in a while, and it's a big part of the strategy component of the game, having to know and memorize in advance when weapons and power-ups are going to spawn. For power weapons, it's not as big of a deal, assuming power weapons are on a static timer, which normally they are. They spawn at set intervals in a game, so let's say 12 minutes, 9 minutes, 6 minutes, and it's rigid, it's stuck like that. A pro team is going to know the spawn time of a power weapon, regardless of whether or not the game tells them. In matchmaking, though, it could be a bigger deal. But what matters more, in my opinion, are the power-ups. Power-ups are historically on a dynamic timer. The timer for the next power-up doesn't typically start till the current one gets picked up. So if you're a pro team and you pick up a power-up and the enemy team doesn't know, you earn a timing advantage to set up for the next power-up later, which creates an interesting dynamic, not only for the competitors, but for the viewers and for the casters as well, because the commentators, they'll point it out and they're on board, as this is happening. So it's exciting on all fronts, I think, to have these timers removed. Specifically for power-ups. For power weapons, it might actually be interesting to do this as well. Like, imagine if you picked up a rocket launcher and the enemy team somehow didn't see it. Normally, they'll get some insight. But if the timer for that next rocket didn't start till the current one was selected, that could lead to another interesting, layer of strategy that, we haven't seen in Halo in a while. So, I'm open to all of this. I think there's a, a good opportunity here. Next, Grapple. I don't have any issues with the Grapple. I don't think I've heard any complaints with it either, but if you do have a complaint, maybe let me know in the comments so I can figure out what it is. Maybe just its availability and the fact that it can kind of give you free access to objectives sometimes, like grabbing a flag out of center map or grabbing an oddball, let's say. But overall, I'd say it's an exciting equipment, both in competitive and for the spectators as well. It just has a lot of versatility, from movement to grabbing weapons, making out plays. It's powerful with the sword, but I feel like that was more the sword's problem than the grapple's problem. Either way, I think it's okay. The thrust, on the other hand, is a little more controversial. I know that 343 had mentioned in a recent update they plan to make changes to the thrust. I think the issue here is how quick and how jarring the change in direction is when you use it, especially if your opponent doesn't have one. It's almost like an auto win in a gunfight because it's very hard to track when a player is jumping out and thrusting a different direction. So we might see a little change there. I know recently Snakebite had mentioned he felt like, especially on Aquarius, there was just too many of them in play because there's 2 on the map. They spawn 1 minute after pickup, so players always have them. And if the enemy team has 2, you're looking at a pretty, snowbally kind of game because you're getting around the map so quickly, getting in and out of fights so quickly. So combine it with something like a Sidekick or a Heatwave, and you've got some, pretty aggressive spawn control that you can create with it. So I guess we'll just wait and see. I do hope they don't nerf it to the ground, though. If anything, just copy Halo 5's thrust. Like, you got it right in Halo 5. I would just kind of copy-paste, do that. Noob combo, you put it in the checkmark list, which is interesting. Noob combo right now is extremely powerful after the buff. The homing, the tracking on it made it a lot more consistent, so it's being used more frequently. The reason I think it's here, though, is because there's always been very obvious drawbacks to the noob combo. You have to charge it if you want the, charge shot, which takes time, and it's also loud as hell. And the audio cues in Halo Infinite are loud as they are, right? So usually you can hear it coming in advance. If you do catch somebody off guard and they have to charge it in the moment, there's always that kind of difficult dynamic of, should I charge, should I spam, right? So there are some pretty significant drawbacks that I think make it okay in a competitive environment. I understand why he has it here. The only thing is just accessibility. Once again, if it's spawning too frequently and too many players have it, then it starts to lose that value, that exciting component. Sidekick. Now, despite the fact that this weapon has bloom, and historically in Halo, bloom is, kind of a no-no, I think that Sidekick kind of gets it right, though. Like, the weapon works in its intended environment very well, and outside of it, it takes a lot of skill to hit shots consistently, precisely. So I think it's a good weapon. I'd like to see it more, to be honest, on more competitive maps, because it is an interesting part of the sandbox, and it's only on 1 map currently. Skewer as well, I don't think there's any issue with it. It's, 1 shot, 1 kill, long-ass reload, right? So there's some clear drawbacks to having it. It is a power weapon that spawns once every 3 minutes. No real massive impact on the game. The Stalker, I've heard, from some pros, they say it's too easy. It's a 3-shot kill. It does have some aim assist. If you're a good player, you can just melt with it. I think it was a bigger problem back when we combined it with the drop combo. Now that the drop combo is not in play, it's not as much of an issue. You do have to be very precise to, make sure you get that perfect kill every time. So all good. This is all fair game. Okay, that's out the way. Now for the naughty list, we'll call it, I guess. The list of weapons that the pros have issues with and why I think that is. Now, Pulse Carbine, I think for obvious reasons. It's a homing gun. You shoot a burst, the burst homes onto the enemy, which clearly doesn't require a ton of accuracy or precision to land. And And that's the reason why, it's generally not favored, especially considering if a full burst lands on a target, it rips their entire shield off clean. So not a lot of work has to go into removing the shields off of an enemy, assuming you hit the shot. It does have its own risk and drawback, but generally speaking, not a lot of skill involved in landing shots. The Commando is an interesting one because the pre-patch version before the winter update, the pros actually really liked. It was much less forgiving, it was less accurate, it took a lot of skill to fully master, and it had an interesting evolution over the life of Halo Infinite Esports. Pros got a lot better with it down the line right before the update than they were, earlier on in the season. It was cool to see that evolution. Now, the new version, the casuals like it a lot, which is great, but it's very powerful now. It's got more forgiving bullet magnetism. The headshots land more consistently, so you're just shredding with it at a close range, and you're tapping heads at a long range. So pros are just much more effective all around, to the point where it's become an issue, even though it's a precision weapon, which is, typically speaking, precision weapons are loved by the pro scene. So it's in a tough spot because it's very forgiving right now. Now, the shield wall, I'm actually surprised is in this list. And if you're a pro player watching, maybe you can enlighten us in the comments as to why, because I'm not sure. Yes, if the wall is down in a 1v1, you're probably going to win that 1v1. You can use it to block nades or block a rocket as well, but it takes time to deploy, so you can't just, last second throw it out and expect to use it to win. If you do deploy it, it's not like your opponent can't back down from that fight as well and then kind of come back or, use cover and shred it. It shreds quickly, right? You can take down the wall pretty quickly, so I don't feel like it's overly rewarding by any means, but I'd be curious to hear, what pros think about it. I also think there's kind of an evolving, I don't know if it's evolving, but there's a meta around it too, in how you can deploy it as well. I was watching Lucid recently. He had a cool little strategy for throwing it up on tower before he jumps up. So little things like that I think are, make it interesting in competitive play. Heatwave and Bulldog. I'm a fan of the Heatwave, personally. It's a newer weapon in the Halo franchise. It's unique in its design with the 2 firing modes, horizontal and vertical. It is definitely powerful. If used right, it's a 2-shot kill, as is the Bulldog. The Heatwave has a range on it, though, too. In a pro's hands, they tend to snap and hit targets like they're practically sniping with the thing. Combine that with the ability to ricochet bullets off walls, which I guess is an advantage and a disadvantage. It's definitely powerful. Shotguns, in general, have been a controversial point in competitive play for a while, considering they are not the most skillful. They got a wide forgiving reticle to work with. They don't really promote skillful gameplay strategies as well. They tend to promote campier gameplay, hiding around a door, let's say, getting a quick kill. There's not much room for outplayability or much room for a combat dance with them. So they're difficult to work around in competitive play. That said, balancing wise, I don't think there's any issues with these guns. I think they're in a pretty good spot balance wise. Once again, it just comes down to weapon availability, how much ammo is in the weapon, where it spawns on the map, all stuff we'll talk about later. Shocks, I have definitely heard complaints about shock nades. They can be pretty powerful. If you get hit by one, they could rip off your shields or kill you, depending on how weak you are. They slow you down and make it difficult to escape and make you vulnerable to, say, a second one. They used to offer an auditory and visual tick every time they hit a target, revealing your location, which that was a problem. Thankfully, that was balanced and competitive down the line. So that, I'd say, is in a good spot. There is still an audio cue when they hit, but it's not as noticeable. And then the biggest issue right now, I'd say, is the range. And the fact that this doesn't happen often. Sometimes the range is unpredictable and a little random. It's capable of killing players through walls and around cover at times. And I think in a competitive environment, a nade that's capable of doing that for very little effort is problematic. And spikes currently suffer from a similar issue. They can do a lot of damage, but I think the main problem pros have with them is the range and the unpredictable kind of randomness of it. A spike nade, of course, blows up into shards that bounce around in the environment. Those shards go pretty damn far. There's a few clips from pros, one from Frosty, for example, where he's sitting under Tiger's Ledge on streets and someone throws it into top A and the shard bounces out and hits him way off. Little unintended random components like that can be a problem in competitive play. So it's tricky because at the same time, I've seen pros like Ryan Noob defend the spike nades and say that if thrown in certain places, they offer very consistent, very reliable results, suggesting that there is a skillful element to spike nades. So it's a tough balancing act of, is there a way to nerf the range, the distance that they bounce, or the fact that maybe they home onto target, something Snakebite had mentioned. Same with the shocks, some way to make it so they're not, going over or through geometry to kill players. If you can remove that, I think they're in a good spot. There's the availability component as well, which we can also touch on. Next, Repulse, another kind of surprising one. I'd say the Repulsor is one of the most exciting new additions to Halo Infinite Sandbox. It's got a wide range of capabilities, some of which is very skillful if you combine it with movement in various ways, or reflected nade, let's say, last second. It can also be less skillful if you catch somebody off guard. You can, with a single button press, knock them off the map. But generally, the excitement, the skill component outweighs that. Mound actually clarified this on Twitter, though. He said the main issue pros have with the Repulsor is online connection and desync issues in Infinite combined with the Repulsor. Man's got a point. The whole process of like melee trading with the Repulsor in Infinite can be inconsistent, clunky, downright broken at times. It's just weird. There's also situations where the Repulsor launches you like way farther than you should. I saw Naded get launched off Catalyst. There's weird online inconsistencies with it that make this a valid point. The issue is it's hard to justify like GAing a Repulsor based on online when LAN tournaments aren't a problem, right? So in general, all of these Repulsor spikes, shocks, and shield wall, I doubt we'd ever see any sort of GA on these items because of the way they spawn, and Spartan had mentioned this. Players can just walk over it and pick it up accidentally, making it very difficult to remove it from competitive play. So regardless of the balancing of these items, they're going to stay. If I had to predict, it's more so down to developers making little updates to whether it's servers or the item itself to improve things. Mangler Sword, I've talked about these weapons in a previous video. The gist of it is Mangler is forgiving. It's not hard to hit shots with. It's got a lot of aim assist and bullet magnetism. It halves your shields per shot. Despite the removal of drop combo, it's still in a tough spot. The Sword, it was an issue with map design, the tight corridors on a map like Recharge, and the campy gameplay it promotes. Internet connection and the Sword is kind of troublesome. And then the trade window, which recently did get updated. The trade window is improved on it now, and that gives me some hope that we could see the Sword favored in competitive eventually. I love the Sword personally from like an entertainment standpoint. I think with the right map, a map like Heretic, let's say, with a lot of open space, I think the Sword could still work, and kind of limiting, how much use you have with it, how often it spawns. Hopefully we see it return. Assault rifle, automatic weapons in general are not favored in competitive Halo and never have been. Go back to classic MLG. Nobody's ARing anybody. The AR sucked back then. In Halo 5, automatic weapons were a problem all throughout Halo 5. In Infinite, I don't think the AR is a big issue. It's not like horribly balanced or overpowered. I think it's just not skillful. It's got a wide reticle. It's very forgiving. It's just not a skillful weapon. Shock rifle. Considering I'm not a pro, I straight up disagree with this one. I love the shock rifle. I think it's very satisfying to get kills with. I know that in the hands of a pro, that little bit of aim assist and bullet magnetism is just enough that pros go off with this thing. They clean up shop with it. Though from a viewership perspective, some of the best clips we've seen over the past year in Halo esports have been shock rifle clips. So I personally wouldn't adjust the balance of this thing. I think it's entertaining. It's more so down to availability. So let's finally talk a bit about availability, because in the end of the day, I don't think the individual balance of every weapon is really the core issue that pros are having here. Even though I just spent like 18 minutes talking about it, rebalancing a weapon affects everybody. Halo is much more than a competitive game. You want to see variety and accessibility in other areas. But in competitive, like I said about the rockets being a perfect power weapon, their clear value is offset by their availability, so that skill is the priority that you want to apply to every weapon on the map here. And a perfect example is just by comparing classic Halo competitive settings to what they are now. Here is a very simple example, and thank you, Generic, for the lovely graphic. Just compare Halo 3's MLG settings to this. This is Emprion's competitive sandbox currently. You got 4 throwable fusion coils, 2 needlers, 2 plasma pistols, 2 ARs, a drop wall, 2 turrets, 4 plasma nades, 2 sidekicks, a rocket with 4 rockets, 4 frags, an OS, 2 spikes, Heatwave, 2 commandos, 2 snipes, and a repulsor. Compare that to the pit in Halo 3. With competitive settings, you got 2 maulers, 6 BRs, 12 frags, 4 plasmas, 2 snipes, OS, rockets, sword. That's it. That's the whole map. Can you spot the difference here? One is a highly successful Halo esports title. The other is Halo Infinite. Highly successful, Halo Infinite. Should the pro community have to explain why detachable turrets and throwable fusion coils are not skillful and do not lead to well-earned kills? At what point does this become an insult to your competitive community? Like, what exactly was the objective here? Because this game has been out for over a year. So is this 343 just trying to make competitive Halo as accessible as possible, which admirable, if so. But I don't think that competitive Halo originally succeeded because it was accessible. I think it succeeded because it was skillful. Having an inherently skillful game inspires people to play it. It gives value and meaning to those that put time into it. Powerful weapons in Halo are historically limited in accessibility to ensure that skill is a priority. And I understand that some sandbox diversity is important and good for viewership and a natural evolution of Halo, but if you litter your map with unskillful, easily accessible weapons, players will just abuse the advantages of those weapons, and at some point, your esport becomes a joke. If you want Halo esports, the competitive side of Halo, to succeed, accessibility matters, but skill expression is more important. If you can find a balance that prioritizes skill, the competitive community will fall in love with the game. They will say good things about it, and those good things will inspire its popularity. Accessibility takes a backseat. People who actually dedicate time to competitive games don't do it because they're accessible. They do it because they're inspired to by the skill in the game. Look at Counter-Strike. It takes no prisoners, but it is highly successful. So let's find that perfect balance. Here's a tweet from Lucid that I agree with. He says, my 2 cents on what the GA, every tier 1 weapon is treated like it's a tier 2. Every single weapon on the map drops to half the ammo it has right now. Some weapons may still need to be removed entirely, but it's a start. For clarity, in case you don't know, there's 3 tiers of weapons. Tier 1 is the lowest tier. If you pull a weapon off a tier 1 rack, a new one spawns 30 seconds later, regardless of who's holding one. For tier 2, only one player can possess the weapon on that rack at a time. If you pull the weapon off the rack, the timer, the 1-minute timer for the next one won't start till the current one on the map despawns. Tier 3 is power weapons like rockets on special timers. I like this tier idea because if you do this, you don't necessarily have to remove any of the existing weapons on the maps. You can still keep sandbox diversity. You just limit those weapons to one player at a time as opposed to them continuously spawning regardless of who's holding them. If you want to find a difference between tier 1 and tier 2, you could maybe say a 30-second cooldown after the weapon despawns for tier 1 weapons and a 1-minute cooldown after weapon despawns for tier 2. Or some variation of this. It would be a step in the right direction either way, and I think the point here is that there needs to be an ongoing discourse between the pro community and the developers to find that perfect balance. And finally, we are seeing that on Twitter, which is wonderful. So shout out to Brian, 343 Taxi. He's a gameplay lead at 343. He says, late to the party, but do you feel increasing the respawn cooldown would also work? Reducing ammo off the rack and reducing the amount that spawn both increase the scarcity for the pickup weapons. Having the ammo gives us more weapon turnover on death, which is important to us. Brian has a good point. He's saying the ammo in these weapons is important. If you kill somebody who's holding one of the weapons, there might be some ammo left over for you to then use it, which is the weapon turnover could be an exciting part of the game. So Lucid says if that's the case, then the initial weapon pickups need to last on the map much longer, so new full-stocked weapon isn't respawning as quickly as they do now. It's okay for weapons to be in play, but every weapon currently is in play all the time. There's no downtime. Lucid has a really good point. This happens especially with the tier 2 weapons very often as they despawn very quickly. Like I'll die with the shotgun in my hands. It drops to the floor literally 10 seconds later or less. It's already despawned. It's already back on respawn. So I agree with Lucid here once again. I think weapon turnover, if you want to keep the ammo the same for these weapons, then keep them on the map, sitting on the floor longer, so there's more time for people to pick them up and play with them. Even then, I think you could look into lowering the ammo of some of the weapons like the shock rifle, for example. But either way, it's good to see this communication. It's a step in the right direction. Point here is pros don't actually hate the sandbox, most of them at least. They're not trying to nerf the game to the ground. They just want the competitive side of the game to be as competitive as possible. I've said this before. I think the best way to do this would probably be to have an HCS dedicated playlist eventually, like the MLG playlist back in the day, something that's more competitive focused and more flexible to change and with more open lines of communication between pros and developers to ensure they get things right. I understand this is much easier said than done. That can lead to a lot of butting heads. I'm sure it takes a lot of resources. I know that the HCS team as well is a very small team. Here they are. So I don't really know what this looks like on the corporate side. None of us know, right? We've got no idea what kind of development hurdles or budgetary hurdles these teams have to deal with to keep this ship sailing, So what we do know, though, is that with all the feedback on the sandbox throughout the year, to come out with Argyle and Empryon the way that they were, there is a clear, lack of communication here that hopefully we can start to see resolved over time. Now, this last paragraph in this article just released a week ago. says, on the topic of maps, modes, and settings, you can expect to see the full list of map mode combinations in the new year, as well as some updates to settings on Argyle and Emprion based on player feedback. Additionally, the studio is working on a balance update to land just before Charlotte to further refine competitive play just before the big event. Look for more specifics in early January. So thankfully, some progress here. If you're a competitive-focused player, you're unhappy with the current settings, looks like Argyle and Empyrean, I keep messing up the map name, will be changing in the near future. There'll be another, more information on another update close to Charlotte, hopefully not too close to Charlotte. Either way, ball is rolling. Try to be patient. Once again, I guess is all I can say, my fellow competitive players. And, hopefully we start to see things improve more quickly in the future. But that's all I've got for today. If you made it this far, I appreciate you. Happy holidays. I hope it's a great one. Long discussion today on weapon balance and competitive settings. What do you guys think of the competitive settings? What would you change? Let's get that conversation started in the comments below. If you like this content, remember to like and sub. And as always, good luck on the way.